Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us Across the Fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. This month marks the 160th anniversary of the Land Grant College Act. What's that, you might ask? Vermonters may know that the University of Vermont is one of the original 57 land grant universities, or that the act itself is also called the Morrill Act. It is named for Justin Morrill, who was the Vermont congressman, later U.S. senator, who sponsored the original legislation that was signed into law by President Lincoln in 1862. The Morrill Act is considered one of the most significant pieces of education legislation in our country's history. And yet, there are other aspects of the Act's history that are racist and that have negatively impacted Indigenous and Black people. Today, we'll learn about the full impacts of the Land Grant College Act with our guest, Roy Beckford. Roy is the director of UVM Extension and Associate Dean of the university's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. He is also a history buff who has presented talks on the origins of the land grant college systems. Good afternoon, Roy. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Fran.
So let's start chronologically. 160 years ago, it is 1862. The country is engaged in civil war, and yet there's this emergence of the land grant system. What did it do, and what is its significance?
So, as you rightly stated, the Vermonter Justin Morrill was essentially the force behind the Morrill Act, which later became known as the Land Grant Act. And that's what Morrill helped to shape. He was a businessman who retired early at age 36 and went into politics. And so by somewhere around 1852, he won a seat to Congress, and became interested in the idea of higher education. Spent a lot of his efforts during those early years trying to shape something like that. In fact, he actually had an earlier version of the Land Grant Act brought to the floor in 1859, but it was vetoed by then President Buchanan. It wasn't until 1862 that the new president, Lincoln, signed the Land Grant Act into law. The idea really was to provide federal land to states who were not in opposition to the United States at the time. And then this land would be either used or sold to establish higher education institutions, colleges and universities to serve local people.
So the Morrill Act really was the founding of public higher education in the United States.
Absolutely, because prior to this, in the United States, higher education really was about studying divinity, religion, that kind of thing. So what Land Grant Act did, and what the Morrill Act essentially did, was to establish degrees in the arts and the sciences and agriculture and in the mechanic arts. So in essence, it changed what higher education looked like in the United States, from just the idea of divinity to the idea now of introducing science and arts into the public domain. That's essentially what the Land Grant Act did, or the Morrill Act did, in terms of how it established higher institutions of education in the United States.
Right, and very practical education. And, you know, but for all the benefits in 1862, there was also something really wrong. So Morrill came up with the Second Morrill Act. It's many years later, but why was this act so important?
So one has to take themselves back to the 1860s. Remember, what was going on there was a civil war. A driving force or issue within the Civil War was the issue of slavery. On the issue of what happened to Black people when they came out of this institution of chattel slavery. The problem was that the 1862 Land Grant Act that Morrill helped pass did not benefit those people who came out of chattel slavery, Black Africans or African Americans, to put it properly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They were not accepted, or they could not attend university, the 1862 university. So the idea of a newer version or a second version of the Morrill Act in 1890 was to address that, particularly in the Confederate States, where Black people were not allowed to be educated, much more to attend college. It was not conceivable back in those days. So the Second Morrill Act of 1890, that Morrill, as an older man, brought to the floor, and it passed, was to essentially address those inequities and racist tendencies towards people of African heritage.
And that was very, very important. And there are some historically Black universities and colleges that remain today from that grant.
Absolutely. So that establishes the 1890 Land Grant Act established some of the first historical colleges and universities in the United States. And many of them still exist today. In fact, some of them are in fairly equal footing with the 1862 Land Grant universities in terms of the kind of outreach they carry out. And the impact they have on agricultural development and science and so on. The difference, though, is that in 1862, land was granted for the establishment of the early universities, the white universities and colleges. Money was given to the Black colleges and universities, and in some cases, the colleges and universities, the Black colleges and universities, did not get the money. So inequities continued, but I don't think that was the intent of Morrill. I think he had a purer heart when it came to the idea of bridging those divides.
Right, and the act said that money was supposed to get there or land, and for some it did not. So there were still some real problems around this, as there were in many areas in the United States. So. Yeah. Just to continue down this track, we have the original Morrill Act, and then 28 years later, we have the Second Morrill Act to address some of these major inequities and race restrictions. And then it would take until 1994 to address another major inequity. So tell us about that.
Right. So remember that the 1890 Land Grant Act was established as a consequence of what was observed, the inequities observed between people who were white and people who were Black. Mm-hmm. Well, the fact of the matter is that federal land was used to establish the land grant institutions, at least the earlier ones. But all that time, Native Americans had less access, and certainly they did not have equal status with the Land Grant Institution, or Land Grant Act. And so in 1994, President Clinton. Decided that it was time enough to address this further issue of making sure that Native Americans had equal access to the land grant success. And so the Equity in Educational Land Grant Status Act was established in 1994, quite a significant number of years later, to address the issue there, the further inequity of the divide between the white universities, the Black ones, and now tribal colleges were established to address that issue. So basically what happened is that there's a one-time endowment of about $23 million to be divided up among 29 colleges across the United States. That looks like a little bit of money, but I think it was a first step to addressing a major issue that starved the Native Americans, not just of their land, but of education.
And those tribal colleges continue to get money, of course. There was that one influx of money, but they continue to get some money. And the irony is that these federal lands also, you know, was kind of a land grab. The lands that were given originally were Native American lands.
That's the challenge. That's the issue with the land grant status. And so a lot of people these days have come, not a lot, maybe quite a few people have come to criticize the land grant and refer to it as a land grab, because much of that land that the federal government gave away, for example, the state of Vermont initially got 150,000 acres of land, equivalent to the number of people they had in Congress at the time. And where did that land come from? It was really through various means that the federal government used to take land away from Native tribes, Native Americans. And much of the land, I mean, that land could not, I mean, as was identified through some research that some UVM students did some years ago, somewhere around 2018, 2019, they found that much of that federal land was not sourced in the state of Vermont that benefited the University of Vermont. It was found in the Midwest, and
it wasn't even from here.
Challenges.
So we have very little time, and so there's this whole question of means to an end. But let's just quickly, the legacy of the Morrill Act today.
So the legacies are multiple. On the one hand, you have an issue where it was considered a land grab. Land was taken away from Native people, and they were essentially alienated from education and access to their own lands and so on, their own culture. But all in all we told, I think the idea of, especially the one that Morrill had, was to create some kind of equity in education. But the land grant as a pure motive introduced higher education to the United States that set it on course to becoming the greatest country in the world. That is the biggest legacy. But we have to use that legacy to benefit the others who were made deficient over that time period.
Absolutely. Roy Beckford, thank you so much. You can get in touch with Roy. He is open to that. He is at the State Extension Office at UVM. You can call 1-866-622-2990, or you can email him at extension@uvm.edu. Thank you so much, Roy, for this scholarship and your wonderful work with Extension at UVM.
Thank you, Fran.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.